So yeah, I mean, basically the title of this meeting is Unbelievably Broad Strategies of Anti-Capitalism, and so what I'm going to sort of focus on is looking at the recent anti-capitalist movement and particularly comparing it to the anti-capitalist movement last time in the wake of the Battle of Seattle in 1999, and sort of looking at actually the problem of strategy in these movements and possible ways of overcoming it, but also looking at the kind of implications that the anti-capitalist movement has had. And so I think it's important to note that challenging capitalism as a system, as a whole, and posing alternatives to it is firmly back on the agenda. And I think, that the depth of the global economic crisis means that not only those who are sort of resisting austerity, who are building campaigns, are thinking about alternatives to capitalism and are talking about capitalism as a system, but we even have the Financial Times publishing a series on capitalism in crisis. We have our leading politicians, David Cameron, talking about creating a more ethical capitalism. And so on both sides of the argument, we have people talking about the capitalist system, and I think this is a direct influence of the anti-capitalist movement and the sort of the period of struggles that have arisen since the beginning of the crisis. And so I think we can look at the sort of mass revolts that have an anti-capitalist tone that have happened over the past sort of 2 years and a half. And I think you go from the revolutions in the Middle East and North Africa to the movement of the Indignados in Spain, a very youthful movement occupying squares, and the similar protests in Greece, to the student revolt in Britain in 2011, to the rise of Occupy Wall Street and the global explosion of occupations that took place after the 15th of October Day of Action in 2011. And as well as this, what I wanted to talk about at the end is actually the return of the mass strike and how we've seen the mass labour movement growing alongside the anti-capitalist movement over the last couple of years. And so with the Indignados movement in Spain and the Occupy movement, many commentators sort of talked about a rebirth of the anti-capitalist movement that we'd seen post the Battle of Seattle in 1999. And so I think it's quite important to think about that movement and the kind of context in which it emerged. So Chris Harman spoke, I'll quote Chris Harman when he was talking about the events of the Battle of 30th of November 1999. And he said, "Sometimes the symbolism of events gives them an importance out of all proportion of the numbers of people directly involved in them. Such was the case with the protests outside the Seattle meetings of the World Trade Organization on the 30th of November 1999. The demonstrations were not particularly large compared with many since. There were perhaps 30,000 demonstrators at the height of the protests. But they signalled something of enormous importance. Almost exactly 10 years earlier, the fall of the Berlin Wall had been presented as the end of socialism, leaving capitalism in apparently unchallenged control of the world for the rest of humanity's existence. And Seattle was the eruption of a new challenge." And I think that we have to see that actually the process and the development of the anti-capitalist movements this time round has been very different. I mean, Chris Harman talks about these very small numbers of people in comparison to the symbolic importance of them. Whereas actually, the demonstrations of the 15th of October 2011, when it was called for a day of occupations, I think we have to see that it heralded the return of a truly global anti-capitalism, and these demonstrations were enormous. So compared to last time, millions more people were involved. So it's estimated that well over 1.5 million people protested in 950 cities across the world. So absolutely massive scale, both on an international level and in the level of mobilisations within each country. And the biggest mobilisations were in Spain, where the Indignados movement, the 15th of May movement, who had initially called the Day of Action, brought over 1 million people out across Spain. In New York, you have around 100,000 people gathering. And in Britain, although it was much smaller, you still had over 3,000 people. And I think in every case, if you look at every case of these occupations that took place, every case of these mobilisations, you see that the spirit of the Arab revolutions and the subsequent mobilisations that happened in Spain in Syntagma Square in Athens had enthused and radicalised the people taking part in the protests. And I think, particularly the contribution of Occupy Wall Street, posing this challenge at the heart of global capitalism, in the very belly of the beast, and calling on the 99% to join it was absolutely seismic. And you saw occupations spreading across the world from South Carolina to South Korea. And I think people were unbelievably inspired by the fact that these occupations, these mobilisations had spread completely across the world. And I think, you know, across, when we're thinking about what was happening in people's minds who were taking part in these demonstrations, you know, all in such different situations across the world, that actually, you know, there were battle lines drawn in the popular consciousness of millions of people. And these battle lines were drawn in the terms first popularised by Occupy Wall Street, between, on the one hand, you know, the 1%, this idea of the 1% of the population who've ended up with all the benefits of the last 10 years of economic growth, who control the wealth, who own the politicians, you know, the enemy of the 1%. And on the other hand, you know, everyone else, the 99%, this massive majority who are asserting their collective power. And so I think, you know, the importance of the slogan, "We are the 99%, really cannot be underestimated, and I'm going to talk about it a bit more later. And so although there are, you know, big similarities between the anti-capitalist movement this time and the anti-capitalist movement of 1999, there are significant differences to the extent that I'll argue we should see what happened over the last couple of years as actually a new form of anti-capitalism altogether. And so, you know, this tactic of occupying a symbolic space, of taking over this symbolic space, harked back to the anti-capitalist movement last time. But this time, because you have, you know, I think the fact that the events in Tahrir Square, the 18 days of the revolution, where people were watching every day what was the developments going on, every day watching Al Jazeera, and those images of people in the square joyously celebrating when Mubarak fell, this is, you know, this means that the occupation of a public space and this kind of tactic has a whole different evocative power. Actually, people, you know, associate the image of occupying a space with actually the power of people to bring down a dictator, and I think that's a really important shift. And as well as you know, the actual aspect of revolution being back on the stage of history, the 1990s anti-capitalist globalization protests took place at a time of, you know, big economic boom and speculative frenzy, and everything was looking up and people were all doing really well and we were all going to do better than our parents did. Whereas today's occupations are targeting, you know, a global capitalism that is in the deepest crisis. And so there's a very important shift here where this new anti-capitalism has not only emerged hand in hand with the return of revolution. You know, the return of revolution for most people involved in the anti-capitalist movement, young people, these are the first revolutions we've ever seen, the first kind of mass popular movements that have actually achieved, you know, real social change in our lifetimes. And also in the midst of an economic crisis that has exposed capitalism not as a sort of merely nasty system, but actually as a fundamentally unstable one. And so there's a real difference in the kind of context in which the anti-capitalist mobilisation is taking place. Now, one thing that I think we have to point out is that, you know, we shouldn't just see this sort of new anti-capitalism as limited to the Indignados movement and the Occupy movement, but actually the various sort of national manifestations we've seen of revolt against the crisis. I think we can see these as part of a movement of the 99%. And I think the idea that actually the spirit of these mobilisations, the spirit of the 99% of the Occupy movement has fed into every struggle that we've seen since. So the kind of demonstrations you have alongside the mass strikes, the kind of, you know, occupations of spaces you have alongside other activities, everywhere we're seeing the spirit of the 99% feed in. And I think that, you know, it's this complete polarisation between the very top of society and the rest of us, between the rich and the poor, that has struck a chord with all those resisting austerity or struggling for democracy. And I'll talk a bit more later about how this concept of the 99% versus the 1% has actually been a huge leap forward in terms of class consciousness, and that it actually creates a highly popularised form of a class analysis that's consistent with Marxism. And so a question that always comes up is whether these movements are actually anti-capitalist in themselves, because obviously a lot of the calls on in the Occupy camps were for sort of radical reforms, and, you know, a lot of it was kind of spoken in very moralistic terms about the system. And I think it's important to be clear about the content of these movements. And I think we can say quite confidently that, like the post-Seattle movements, they are anti-systemic, in that they're not simply campaigning over particular grievances, whether it's, you know, the environment, free trade, third world debt, but actually they're motivated by a sense of interconnection between an immense variety of different injustices and dangers. And I think that we saw this in the Occupy movement, where you have such an array of people who've come from all different campaigns and are recognising the fact that all these injustices we're facing are part of the same systematic problem, and that, you know, we as the 99% have to tackle them collectively. And so by these criteria, I think we should understand the movements as anti-capitalist, even when, you know, their sort of opposition is crouched in, you know, these moralistic terms of the greedy bankers, or in the language of radical reform. I mean, there was lots of talks about the Robin Hood tax, the kind of big taxes on corporations and all these things. And so I think what I've been trying to get across is like the unbelievable sort of inspirational aspect of these movements, and I'll talk more later about the kind of action that I think they've inspired since. But I think it's also important that we have serious criticisms of these movements too. I mean, the Occupy camps have been, you know, dismantled almost everywhere. And, you know, the question facing us is actually what is the strategy now? That when the camps don't exist, what is the strategy? And so there are a couple of features that I want to sort of criticise and challenge, and we can talk more about in the discussion. So I think that, you know, a big feature of these movements has been the rejection of sort of organisation, of old organisational forms, so the rejection of trade unions, political parties, permanent campaigns. And I think we have to look at why this has happened. And so I think we see with the fall of Stalinism, the general sort of rightward drift of social democracy, and actually the decline of the revolutionary left during the sort of neoliberal period, has meant that many of new activists reject these sort of reject both the sort of traditional reformist organisations, so the social democratic parties and, you know, particular campaigns around reforms, and revolutionary socialism, in favour of new sort of common sense forms of activity that seek alternatives to the problem of organisation. How do we organise ourselves most effectively? And what we've seen is, you know, particularly in the Individualist and the Occupy movement, is the elevation of the tactic of occupation, which has been used, you know, throughout history, the tactic of occupying a space in order to organise, in order to shut down a particular section, in order to take control of a particular space. We've seen the elevation of this tactic to a strategic imperative. And so that actually the creation and maintaining of the camps, the creation and maintaining of the occupations becomes a goal in itself for many of the activists. And I think we have to look at why this has happened. Why is this sort of tactic being seen as a strategic imperative? And I think it partly stems from an attempt to overcome the need for a political party. Because with the occupation you replace the political party with actually the occupation of a physical space. And so you have an organising centre, which is a physical organising centre instead of an organisational organising centre. And so the kind of organisation you have remains, you know, very informal, consensual. You can take all your decisions on direct democracy. And so out of this, you know, you have this concept of the network, the idea that we know we're not organisations, we're networks. And I think this concept of the network is, you know, arises time and time and again to suggest that sort of old forms of organisation, I need to keep remembering to do this when I say old forms of organisation, that these old forms of organisation are necessary, that we can use these horizontal networks of activists who are loosely connected. We don't need any leaders, we don't need any strict adherences to any particular ideologies, and we can maintain a movement and create a strategy using these horizontalist networks. And indeed, Paul Mason, who's the economics editor of Newsnight, who kind of distilled a lot of the ideas going around these movements in his book Why It's Kicking Off Everywhere, has suggested that there's been fundamental shifts in human behaviour because of social networking, the use of media and the ease with which we can access it. You know, people tweeting about demonstrations means that we have this completely different idea of self, and we have this idea of the network society. And I was going to talk quite a lot about his theories around this, but I'm hardly anywhere near through my talk, so I think I'm going to try and summarise by saying that he's argued that, you know, this kind of the shift in the way people relate to each other, this idea of the network society, facilitates a clear break with old forms of organisation, including parties, unions, and permanent campaigns. And he's saying that because we have these, you know, horizontalist networks, they form an opposition to these kinds of organisation. Now, I think there are a number of problems with this. Firstly, I think that a lot of these theorists are underplaying the role that actually organisations and these kind of old forms of organisation and political parties, trade unions, have actually played in the movements of recent. I mean, like the SWP has played quite a large role in a lot of the UK uncut actions, in a lot of the occupations, not only the student occupations, but the actual Occupy mobilisations. And a lot of permanent campaigns have been involved as well. And so I think there's a real sort of airbrushing out of the picture, the fact that actually there were people on the ground organising these things, rather than it sort of getting the picture that it was some sort of Twitter-fueled mobilisation. But also, this idea of the network faces a fundamental problem with strategy. And this is where the sort of title of the meeting starts to creep in. And I mean, the real motivation for this talk of networks is this idea that we can defeat the hierarchy that has plagued organisations. And so Paul Mason repeatedly asserts that the network defeats the hierarchy. We've created this new form of organisation that overcomes the problems of hierarchy. But he leaves us with an unbelievably bleak picture of the movement in Britain. And so he says, to quote him, "The horizontalist movement, which grew out of the student occupations, is left in a crisis of direction that it is still struggling to recover from. The reason being that there was a problem with which youthful, socially networked horizontalist movements would have everywhere when things got serious, the absence of strategy." And so Mason's kind of argument is that actually, this is a fundamental problem. These kind of loose horizontalist networks of people can't actually develop a strategy, and I think we need to look at why that is. So Mason argues in terms of the way that tactics are decided on in this kind of network movement. And he says, ideas arise, are very quickly market tested, and then either they take off, they bubble under, insinuate themselves into mainstream culture, or if they're no good, they disappear. So it's this idea that, people will, new ideas about tactics will come up very quickly. If they catch on, great, we'll go with it, it will spread across the globe. If they don't, then they're no good. And I think the problem is that when we're talking about strategy, if we're talking about strategy for anti-capitalism, actually how do the 99% win? What does it mean for these tactics to be good or bad? Surely it should be about how successful they are in actually creating some kind of fundamental social change. And the idea that a tactic catches on doesn't necessarily translate to that directly. And so I think this danger of deciding tactics by waiting to see what catches on opens up the possibility that activism may be extremely rewarding in the short term. You come up with these great new exciting innovative ways of organising, they catch on across the world or they don't, but there's this constant flux of ideas. But actually this is sort of taken up at the expense of strategic thinking about the long-term goals. Actually, how do the 99% win? Where are we best placing ourselves? How are we organising? And I think this, is reflected in the way that often decisions were made in the Occupy camps, in a lot of the student occupations. I mean, the occupations I was involved in at my university, there was this real drive for consensus decision making. That actually, we need to reach a point where everyone feels happy with the decision, that we can go ahead. And I don't want to talk too much. I think it will obviously come up in the discussion about consensus decision making. But I think that it's reflective of this problem where, often a lot of the time is spent sort of discussing how we're going to make decisions, what we're going to make decisions about, rather than actually making the decisions. And this is a common criticism. But actually, 5 minutes, my God. But actually that it's very difficult to actually formulate a strategy and decide on it. Because I think if you look at these kind of broad movements, there's this real drive for, the fact that no matter what political ideas we hold, actually we all have the same goal. But when it comes to strategy, there are serious differences between activists. And by considering the movement in terms of these sort of networks, these loose networks, and trying to strive for consensus, you actually kind of mystify the serious differences between activists, and it becomes very difficult to actually formulate a strategy for the 99% to win. And I think this tendency to sort of reify the network leads us up a sort of blind alley when we're trying to understand the movements or to develop a strategy. And I think that it's in fact quite unnecessary to sort of polarise between network and organisation. I mean, I'm from an experimental psychology background, and networks are used in computer science, in neuroscience, to explain, it's an analytical tool that explains sort of relations between actors or nodes. And actually, you know, you can consider organisations in these terms. You consider networks as organisations, as containing organisations, as you know, that organisations may contain networks, and that actually this polarisation isn't very helpful. And I think what actually people are getting at, who are trying to reify this idea of the network, is a rejection of centralisation, is a rejection of a particular form of organisation in favour of decentralised decision making. And I think that given the problems that we've talked about in terms of developing strategy that decentralised networks can have, it becomes necessary to conceive of a method of activity which employs a level of centralisation. Now, one of the objections offered by proponents of networks against centralism is that what I kind of hinted you towards, that the political organisation that centralism implies tends towards the development of leadership elites. And so Paul Mason and many of the other thinkers who've come around the recent movements have talked about Michael's iron law of oligarchy. And Colin Barker has summarised this view as that organisation engenders both oligarchy, which is the emergence of leaders who can prevent challenges to their rule, and conservatism, which is the diversion of democratic movements from their original goals. And Michael's believes that these stem in part from the incompetence of the masses, which is almost universal throughout the domains of political life. Now, Michael's is undoubtedly pointing towards real tendencies within political organisations, that there have existed these tendencies for leaderships to emerge that can prevent challenge to their rule, that movements have been diverted from their original goals. But he kind of, you know, he's looking at it from a perspective that organisation necessarily slips into these things, that centralisation or centralised organisation necessarily slips into these problems. And Duncan Hallis has described this view as a secularised version of the original sin myth, that any form of centralised organising will slip into this. And I think we have to say that in opposition to this iron law of oligarchy, there exists in any party or organisation whose leadership don't actually wield the combined sticks and carrots of state power. I mean, we have to, you know, separate the revolutionary organisation from the organisation of the state and other forms, that there exists an almost universal law of democracy. And so in any voluntary organisation where membership doesn't itself incur material privilege, there's an element of democracy in that the leadership requires the consent of the rank and file in the form of its continuing membership and support. And so I think if we can move away from both the false dichotomy between network and organisation, as well as the sort of, you know, fatalism and determinism that assumes that all political organisation is destined to slide into hierarchical and anti-democratic organisation, it becomes possible to conceive of organisational forms which actually have the ability to resolve strategic and tactical questions in a necessarily democratic manner. Now, I was going to talk for some period of time about the Revolutionary Party as a network, but I think we can talk about that in the discussion. One thing that I was going to talk quite a lot on is the question of the state. I think it's quite important that I quickly point out the differences in terms of our relationship to the state in the anti-capitalist movements between 1999 and now. Because I think the question of centralisation comes into even sharper focus when discussing the role of the state and the power of the centralised state. And after the movement of 1999, there was a lot of theorising. I mean, people will know about John Holloway's, you know, changing the world without taking power argument, that actually we don't necessarily need to focus our energies on the state, that we can, you know, create our autonomous gardens of resistance without actually having to come face to face with state power. And in the post-Seattle movement, what you saw was most of the anger was directed about global corporations, multinational corporations. And actually, the question of the state was never resolved because, you know, the anger was directed at these multinational corporations and the question of nation states didn't really come into play. However, I think, you know, in the current period, it's no longer the case that the state is simply deploying the police, though they are doing that, and we'll talk more about that later. But they're also imposing the cuts that are generating the bitterness at the base of society and the anger that have given rise to the protests in the first place. So the state is actually a fundamental focus of people's anger this time around. And I think that actually, therefore, the question of challenging state power and how we actually organise ourselves in order to do that has come much sharper into focus in the anti-capitalist movement this time than it did last time. And on top of this, I mean, in many of the other talks, people have talked about the fact that actually the relationship between the state, between our governments and the police and all the other facets of the state and these multinational corporations and the banks, and you have the Troika in Greece and all the relationships between these things have become unbelievably clear, that actually there's such an interrelation that we can't ignore any one of them. And so I think, I know I'm completely out of time, but I think one important thing that we have to talk about is who are the 99%, who are the agents of change, because if we're developing a strategy for how the 99% can win, we need to think about who the 99% are. And I said at the beginning that Paul LeBlanc has made the point that the Occupy movement has polarised a class analysis that's consistent with Marxism. And he says, to quote him, "The modern day system of corporate rule and exploitation overseen by the wealthy 1% is what we mean by capitalism." That actually this analysis is what we mean by capitalism. And that the heart and soul and the great majority of the 99% are the working class. And therefore the goal of establishing the democratic control of the 99% over our economic and political life is what we understand by socialism. And I had a lot to say about the Occupy Oakland movement and the strength with which the anti-capitalist movement and the Occupy movement there actually related into the labour movement, the relationship between actually organised workers and trade unions not only coming onto the Occupy demonstration, but the occupiers going and supporting pickets, shutting down the docks. I mean, there's some amazing stories from Oakland. And the same in Britain, where actually, at the time, the electricians were having a big dispute, and that they went and visited the Occupy camp. Occupiers came on their picket lines. And I think actually the final point I want to make is that the links between the anti-capitalist movement and the kind of inspiration that it's given to people, to the working class, to take organised working class, to take strike action, and the mass strikes we've seen across Europe and as well in Britain. I don't think the atmosphere of those strikes, the atmosphere on the picket lines, would have been the same without the anti-capitalist movement, and that actually the anti-capitalist movement has played a really important role, not only in building the confidence of people to resist, to fight back, that actually we're involved as the 99% in a global network of people who are all fighting very similar battles against austerity and for democracy. But that as the 99%, we are the force in society that actually can shut it down, and that we have that collective power, and that we recognise ourselves as a part of that class consciousness. And so I'm going to finish there. I had lots more to talk about, but I think people should be able to speak too. So, yeah, thanks.